welcome to this kind of different webinar sponsored by Ukraine, A Time for Peace, the Ukraine campaign of Mass Peace Action. My name is Paul Shannon. Brian Garvey, the executive director of Mass Peace Action, is with us this evening, and he'll be running all the technology. In one way, the Ukraine war is a confusing war of missiles, all kinds of missiles, storm shadows, ATACMS, Patriots, HIMARS, and on and on and on. We see references to these missiles whenever there's an article on Ukraine. Just what are these different missiles and what effect do they have on the war? What differences, if any, are there between those termed offensive and those called defensive missiles? What is the difference between exploding drones, rockets, and missiles? What dangers do these missiles pose of escalation leading to war between the United States and Russia? As we reach the end of October of 2024, almost 3 years after Russia's invasion, there is pressure on President Biden to lift restrictions on sending NATO-made long-range missiles and the NATO technicians needed to fire them to Ukraine, allowing strikes deep into Russian territory. President Putin of Russia has issued several red line warnings, stating that this escalation would create a state of war between the U.S. and Russia. This is the lay of the land on which we are walking now. So we have reached a critical point in this war in Ukraine. It is worth paying attention to this war and doing something about it, as our present policy is contributing to the death, destruction, and disaster for Ukraine, and possibly for all of us. As Biden himself has warned that the risk of nuclear Armageddon is at its highest point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So tonight we learn about the missiles that are a key part of this war. Patrick Moran is a nuclear physics researcher at the College of William and Mary, and he is a member of the Nuclear Disarmament Working Group of Mass Peace Action. Richard Krushnic writes about military corporate influence over U.S. foreign policy. He writes also about the Ukraine war and Raytheon Technologies as a key member of the Raytheon anti-war campaign. Richard continues to be involved in the community development financing in Cambridge, Massachusetts, as well as in Nicaragua. Richard works with MAPA's nuclear disarmament and Latin America and Caribbean working groups, and he is also a key person in the mass public banking campaign that's been going on for a number of years in Massachusetts. We are grateful to Patrick and Richard for sharing their expertise with us on this important topic. So, Richard, why don't you begin?
Okay, so let me share my screen. Very good. So to start out, at the beginning of this, just remember the war started in 2014 in the eastern part, the same part that Russia now occupies. Russia didn't occupy it at the time, but in many parts of that area, the majority of the population was Russian, and the primary language was Russian. And so the conflict has been going on there between the rest of Ukraine and that Russian part of Ukraine ever since 2014. So it was between 8 and 9 years of war had already gone on when Russia invaded in 2022. Russia invaded because the US was insistent on getting Ukraine into NATO. Russia felt that having US missiles on 1,300 miles of the Russia-Ukraine border was an existential threat to the existence of Russia, which they could never allow, and therefore they invaded to prevent that from happening. At the beginning of the war, it was very much a missile war. The Ukraine had enough defensive missiles that Russia could not use its aircraft over Ukrainian airspace, and Ukraine couldn't use its aircraft over Russian airspace. So people were launching missiles from the ground or missiles from airplanes, but the airplanes just sort of began approaching the border, but never even got too close to the border because they could be shot down by a defensive missile from the other side. So it was very much a missile war. Then very early on, drones started being used. Initially, they were relatively large drones because that's what either side could lay their hands on. The Ukrainians got fairly large Turkish drones. The Russians got fairly large Iranian drones. And these drones are still being used, and they can go very long distances, hundreds of miles, 1,000 miles. They're easy to shoot down, of course, but the problem is to shoot them down, you have to use a very expensive ground-to-air missile, much more expensive than even the larger drones. So that's a very interesting aspect of it. As time went on, Russia was able to pretty much eliminate the Ukraine's air force, and it was able to, and is still able to eliminate most of Ukraine's defensive missiles, such as the Patriot missile that the US sends in and other NATO countries send in. But when these air defensive missiles, well, the way it works is the Russians send over drones, and but larger drones that can carry a pretty good bomb, they can be kamikaze drones that will dive down and the drone dies when it hits its target. But they can carry pretty good warheads, so they can't be ignored. And then Ukraine sends up its defensive missiles, shoots down the drones. But then in the process of doing that, the Russians discover where those defensive missile emplacements are. And before they can be moved, Russia has spotted them with its satellites, its aircraft, its own drones, and it takes them out with precision-guided bombs or precision-guided medium-range missiles. And so, unfortunately for Ukraine, its missile defenses get taken out nearly as fast as they're sent in to Ukraine by NATO, and they are never able to last too long or able to do too much damage. And that means that Russia doesn't have complete control of the air, but it has relative control of the air, and it can, for the past year and a half, it's been able to fly its aircraft into Ukrainian airspace and launch its precision bombs, which can then travel another 30 or 40 miles, or its air-to-ground missiles, which can travel various distances. And because of this largely imbalance that has arisen in aircraft and missiles, Russia that's a lot of the reason why Russia has virtually won this war. And one of the fascinating things is that as time went on, both sides realized how important drones were. And this became the first drone war that the world has ever seen. And now, today, the most important weapon on both sides in this war, by far the most important weapon, are cheap personal drones, little quadcopters that the drone operator can have a signal out to the drone 2 to 5 miles away. And the drone is big enough that it can carry a payload of 5 to 15 pounds of explosives. And that's enough to disable all armored vehicles that are being used in the war, with the exception of Russia's turtle tanks, where Russia learned to encase its tanks with a cocoon of steel that it welds onto the tank, and that protects the Russian tanks from these small drones. But these drones have cameras, and so they see everything that's near them. And there's just nothing that comes anywhere close to the importance of these drones in the Ukraine war today. And that is the only reason why Ukraine can still fight on for at least a while longer in this war. The only weapon that Ukraine has in any significant numbers are these small quadcopter personal drones that cost between $500 and $1,500, and they can take out, $2 and $3 and $4 million armored vehicles. They can take out, little groups of troops on the ground. They can drop through windows and take out people inside buildings. They can drop into trenches and take out troops in fortified trenches. This is it's now, since Russia is advancing all across the front line, between 600 and 800 miles of the front line now, Russia is advancing, and that means there is a lot of troop to troop combat now because of this Russian advance. But up until maybe 5 or 6 months ago, there was very little contact between the troops on either side. It was all drones that were that was the contact, very little contact between soldiers. So with that background and how the importance of drones and missiles has shifted in the war. Missiles were the key weapons initially, and now it's drones that are the key weapons. And amazingly enough, it's these really inexpensive drones. So the key target on both sides now, the target you want to get far more than any other target is you want to find out where these little personal drone operators are, and you want to take them out. That's by far the most effective thing you can do on the battlefield at this point in time. So each side has drones that are patrolling with their cameras, and they're searching for where a little drone takes off from, or where they think what's going on in a building is drone operators operating from that building. Now on to the missiles. Of course, initially, the Raytheon Javelin anti-tank missile, and also Lockheed was producing them. They were the most important missiles initially, because initially it was this Russian attack, a ground attack, principally a tank attack. And the most effective thing that could be done against these tanks was the use of this Javelin missile, which had a range of a little over 2 miles and was quite accurate. Those basically the U.S. has largely run out of them. It's doubled its production, but it can't supply Ukraine with that many of them anymore. And now Ukraine doesn't really even care because, you know, they've essentially been rendered more or less useless because of these small personal drones that have taken over as much more effective on the battlefield. So that's enough about drones. Now, the primary missiles that are used on both sides, attack missiles, are multiple launch rocket systems carried on trucks that can fire between 6 and a dozen missiles at a time. We use the Lockheed Martin, they call it the M270 MLRS. Oh, wait, I should jump immediately to the map that's up on the screen here. So you can see this between the Ukrainian-Russian border and the dotted red line inside of Russia. That's about 155 miles, right? But if you notice, it's a little over a third of the way to Moscow, you know, and because Russia is set up to defend itself from an attack from NATO, from the West, it has a lot of its important military assets within that 155-mile stretch. It has a lot of air bases there because that way it can get planes over into NATO territory very quickly, and then they can launch their guided bombs or missiles, which go 60 to hundreds of miles further. They've already moved most of their aircraft out of this area, back farther. But they still have, of course, a lot of very important military, all kinds of military, industrial, and energy assets that are vulnerable. What the U.S. has been and NATO have been threatening to do in terms of this, letting these missiles attack into Russia, and Putin has said, well, you do that and we just might start nuking you in the US or in Great Britain or wherever, because we regard that as you being a direct active ingredient in the war and directly attacking Mother Russia. Now, these same missiles have been used in the war all along, and they have been attacking Russia because Crimea became part of Russia in 2014. And so these same missiles, the Storm Shadow and the French, what do they call it? The Scalp, it's the same thing as the Storm Shadow, and the US ATACMS. These missiles have been used all along to attack targets in Ukraine. They're fired from Crimea and just north of Crimea, over on this other side to the western side of Crimea, attacking all kinds of important targets in Crimea and doing significant damage. So it's not that these missiles haven't been used, it's just that they haven't been used in old Mother Russia before, and certainly not in the direction of Moscow. And so these missiles, the only missiles that the US so far was even considering for use in Ukraine. And as Paul mentioned before, don't be confused. It's not that the Ukrainians would use these missiles. It would be NATO people would be firing the missiles, United States satellites and special aircraft and what do you call them? The Global Hawk drones. All these things would be picking the targets, aiming the missiles, guiding them to their targets. So in no real sense would it be Ukraine, nor has it been so far Ukraine using these missiles. It's always been NATO personnel and NATO communications, guidance, equipment, and so on that's been using these medium-range drones. So what the U.S. was considering giving, letting Ukraine launch these missiles into Russia were just certain versions of the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, versions that could go just about this far, 155 miles. But there are other versions of these same missiles that can go a little over twice that far. And of course, the U.S. could consider using those as well. But so far, the talk has only been considering letting them use these versions that would go about as far as that dotted line inside to Russia. But that's enough for Russia to say, do that, and we are in full-scale war. NATO and Russia is in full-scale war, and we will act accordingly. And because of that, in early to mid-October, there was a big debate about this within the United States. Blinken and Sullivan, these neocons who have been in charge of U.S. war policy so far, wanted Biden to do it. But there are elements within the Joint Chiefs of Staff didn't want it to happen, and they prevailed. And Biden has not yet authorized this to happen because our military, at least enough of it, thinks that Russia isn't bluffing and that full-scale war would probably erupt if the U.S. allows this to happen. Now, of course, if that happens, Russia wouldn't immediately launch nuclear weapons. It would use its Iskander, and I forgot the name of the other one, the one that's actually a hypersonic missile that goes more than 5 times the speed of sound. But even the Iskander can go up to 4 times the speed of sound. It's not considered to be a hypersonic missile. But even our defensive missile missed the Iskander more than they ever hit it. And the Russian hypersonic missiles are completely invulnerable so far. We can't take any of them out. And they are intermediate range missiles that they go way farther than this 155 miles. They can take out targets pretty much anywhere in Ukraine. And they are both carried by aircraft. And since Russia now has enough control of the air that they can fly their aircraft quite a distance into Ukrainian airspace, Russia can attack everywhere in Ukraine with these missiles, and there's not too much that NATO or Ukraine can do about it. Partly because, as I said, the Russians are taking out these air defense missiles almost as fast as they're coming in right now. So that's what's most important right now to understand. I want to add something else. Now, the U.S. has had missiles on the Polish and Romanian frontier for a few years now. And they're supposedly surface-to-air missiles, Raytheon surface-to-air missiles, but they're in launch tubes that can also launch nuclear-tipped Raytheon Tomahawk missiles. And the Tomahawk missiles have ranges up to 1,500 miles. So we're not talking about 155 miles or even 340 miles, the longer range Storm Shadows. We're talking about 1,500 miles. Moscow's not even 400 miles from the border. So there's all kinds of missiles that the U.S. and NATO could use inside of Russia, and Russia has the same kind of cruise missiles that it could use in Ukraine or to attack elsewhere, many, all over Western Europe. So we're very far from using all the kind of missiles we have. Now, we could also carry, if the U.S. really, U.S. and NATO now have sent in F-16s, right? Fighter jets. Have you heard anything about F-16s being used in the war? No, you haven't, because they're not being used. They're held back to maybe help do air defense, which the kind of thing Patrick will talk about, of Kyiv or maybe Lviv in the West. Russia's jets are superior to the F-16s. They have much longer range radars. They can detect and fire upon F-16s before the F-16s even detect the Russian fighter jets. So the F-16s they're not a factor at all in this war. And it's very unlikely that they will be. But the U.S. has other aircraft and all kinds of air-to-air missiles and so on that it could employ if it comes to all-out war. Even if Russia started to attack, if the U.S. allowed these missile strikes, it wouldn't start using nuclear weapons. It would start by using its Iskander and the one of the name I forget, the hypersonic missile. They would take out air bases, the air bases that the U.S. would use to launch these missiles from into Russia, from Poland and Romania, and take out those air bases. It'd take out the U.S. bases that are on the borders there that with these launch tubes that could launch nuclear-tipped Tomahawks. They'll take out other military infrastructure, but probably they'd restrict it largely to, they would restrict it only to where Russia was attacked from. If airplanes took off from England and refueled in the air and attacked Russia with missiles, then Russia would fire these conventional missiles at air bases in England and so on, and only after back and forth with a NATO-Russia war with conventional missiles would things escalate to tactical nuclear weapons. And the war would possibly begin with one side or the other using one or two tactical nukes to see what happened next. And every war game so far indicates that what happens next is half of the world's population disappears over a period of 5 or 10 years from nuclear winter. That's what happens next. And so that's where we are right now. And I think that's enough for me about offensive missiles. And so at that, I will turn it over to Patrick.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, I trust you can all see that. If you can't, just let me know. So
Yeah,
Richard, you can see it.
yep.
We see it, yes.
Great, great. So Richard focused on the offensive side of things and the technologies involved there. So I wanted to talk about the other side of the coin. And then towards the end, we can talk about if they're, yeah, the two sides of the same coin, I guess. But these are nominally defensive systems that are being employed in Ukraine, which is what I'll focus on here. So just to give an overview of what I'll cover, I'm going to focus on Raytheon, not just because it's relevant to those of us in Massachusetts, being Raytheon being from Cambridge, of course, but also because Raytheon, as you'll see, provides the core of Ukraine's air and missile defense systems, together with Lockheed Martin to a smaller extent. And both of these companies have been awarded billions of dollars in contracts for the procurement of these systems by the Ukrainians. And just to give a sense of how this is viewed by the Russians and how this is potentially inflaming things on the ground there in Ukraine, I think it's pretty clear that the Russians view the delivery and use of these missile defense systems as a provocation. So just to cite one Russian source here, Dmitry Peskov, the press secretary, he said last year that the tendency to pump weapons, including heavy weapons, into Ukraine and other countries, these are the actions that threaten the security of the continent and provoke instability. So I think it's good for us to wonder whether these are purely defensive and designed to protect, as the name kind of suggests, or whether these have more offensive purposes. So I'll just talk about some of the specific instances of these systems here. So I'll first start with the air defense. So the NASAMS, which are the Norwegian Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, these are developed by a Norwegian company, Kongsberg, in collaboration with Raytheon. They fire the so-called AMRAAM and Sidewinder missiles. These are both manufactured by Raytheon. And the U.S. committed to sending 8 NASAM batteries to Ukraine, with other NATO countries agreeing to send more. And in 2022, Raytheon was given a $1.2 billion contract to develop parts for these NASAM systems. And you can see here on the right, these are 2 photos that were sent out in a tweet by the Ukrainian defense minister in November of 22 upon receiving these NASAM systems. So you can see that these are truck-mounted surface-to-air missiles. And yeah, so this is the first of several, as I mentioned, that were delivered to Ukraine. In addition to these truck-mounted systems, there are also the shoulder-fired Stinger missiles. These are also manufactured by Raytheon. You can see in the photo there, it's a large launcher that you mount on your shoulder and fire like so. And Raytheon was given a $625 million contract in May of 22 for developing these systems for the purposes of sending to Ukraine. And so these air defense systems, they're intended to shoot down manned aircraft, but also unmanned aircrafts like drones, like Richard was talking about. So that's air defense for air vehicles. Now, in terms of shooting down ballistic missiles, there are a number of systems that have been sent to Ukraine from the U.S. and elsewhere in the West. So one of these being the Patriot, or PAC-3, they're sometimes called, for Patriot Advanced Capability System, PAC-3. And this is also a surface-to-air missile system. So similar to the NASAMS, you can see there on the right, these are mounted on a truck and fired from a truck, and so they're mobile as well. These are intended to defend against short to intermediate range ballistic missiles. The U.S. sent 2 Patriot batteries to Ukraine last year, and actually just in the news a couple of days ago, the Norwegians have agreed to send additional Patriot batteries to Ukraine as well. Raytheon received a $1.2 billion contract in March of last year to manufacture these systems for the Ukrainians. And Raytheon, last I checked, there was a report in the Wall Street Journal, Raytheon was planning to send 5 more batteries by the end of this year. This slide was made several months ago, so I'm not sure of the status of that. But in any case, as I mentioned before, the Russians viewed this as fairly provocative, as could maybe be expected. So just a couple of quotes here. One from Maria Zakharova, who's the spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry. She said that by delivering these Patriot systems, the U.S. had effectively become a party to the war in the Ukraine. And Dmitry Medvedev, the former president and the head of their Security Council, he said that Patriot systems and any NATO personnel in Ukraine will immediately become legitimate targets for our armed forces. So, one could imagine the kind of escalation that could occur from Russians firing on NATO personnel, because there are NATO troops on the ground, not combat troops, but for training Ukrainians to use these systems. So that's a potentially escalatory situation right there. So that's the more short range missile defense system. In addition, there's the Aegis missile defense system that is also developed by Raytheon. Raytheon develops the Standard Missile 3 or SM-3 missile that's used by Aegis. And these are intermediate range, or designed to defend against intermediate range ballistic missiles. And they're typically fired from warships. Warships in the Baltic Sea, for example, in the context of Russia and Ukraine. But I say typically fired from warships because there is also a land-based variant known as Aegis Ashore. Aegis Ashore is, as I said, it's the same system, but it's, instead of firing it from a ship, you fire it from land. And currently these are deployed at NATO bases in Romania and Poland. So, in Eastern Europe, right, kind of up on the borders of Ukraine and Russia. Russia views this as a violation of the INF Treaty. The INF Treaty between the U.S. and Russia banned intermediate range. So INF stands for the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and it banned missile defense systems for intermediate range missiles. So the U.S. is a party to this treaty. Russians claim that this is a violation. I think with some reason they claim this. So finally, I want to talk about the European Sky Shield Initiative. This is not a missile defense system in the Ukraine, but it's a missile defense system or an initiative that was developed following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Europeans felt that, if the Russians can invade Ukraine, maybe we're next. And so this didn't just stimulate missile defense systems within Ukraine, but throughout Europe. This is a multi-billion-dollar or multi-billion-euro air and missile defense project. You can see at the top right here, the dark green are the founding countries, the light green are the member nations. I think last I checked, there were 22 member nations throughout Europe. And this is formed in 2022, so it's still in the early stages, but the idea is having 3 layers of missile defense. So you would have a short range system, which would employ the IRIS-T systems, which are manufactured by Germany. The intermediate range defense system would be using these Patriot batteries that I mentioned before, so manufactured by the U.S., by Raytheon. And then the long-range system would be using the Israeli Arrow 3, which is developed by an Israeli defense contractor in collaboration with Boeing, the U.S. Defense contractor. So that's the plan now. It's still in early stages. And again, this is not within Ukraine, but it is stimulated by the war in Ukraine. Okay, so just, backing up and just aside from whether this is the right thing to do or how provocative these systems are, I think probably the first question is, do they even work? And that's, I think, somewhat doubtful given the history and Obviously, the information is all classified, so it's difficult to say. You kind of just have to take the defense contractors and the Defense Department's word for it, which is always a dicey situation to do that. So, but in any case, the Ukrainians claimed in last year that their Patriot battery shot down 18 of 18 Russian missiles during a Russian assault, including these new Kinzhal hypersonic missiles that the Russians are developing. There were a lot of experts that expressed skepticism. Obviously, there were many people that were, cheerleading this, as you would expect, but there were some experts that were sober about it and expressed skepticism. And, there's a long history of these sorts of claims during the Gulf War. There were similar claims of upwards of 95%. That was with earlier Patriot batteries, like earlier models. But those claims were later debunked, saying that they were shooting down these pretty primitive Scud missiles during the Gulf War. So, yeah, I think it's fair to take these claims with a grain of salt. But okay, aside from the effectiveness, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? So I think the concept of missile defense, I think even maybe more dovish people could go along with potentially, because there's this idea that it's not belligerent, it's not offensive, it's just designed to protect. And so it sounds nice when you kind of frame it like that. But I think this is really one side of the coin for the offensive missiles that Richard was talking about. So in one sense, having an effective missile defense system frees up a nation to launch a first strike, because then it protects you against a retaliatory strike from your adversary. So this is kind of a basic principle that was underlying the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. The U.S. and the Russians both realized that, not only would this lead to an undesirable arms race where each nation is trying to build offensive systems that can surpass these defensive systems, but that if one nation gains supremacy in the defensive arena, then it would leave them open to just launch offensive strikes at will without fear of reprisal. So that caused the Russians and the U.S. to agree to limit the usage of anti-ballistic missiles between the two countries, including the INF treaty that I mentioned earlier. In addition to that, these missile defense systems are not even just, they themselves can be offensive. They don't just free you up to use offensive missiles. They themselves can also be interchangeable with offensive systems. So just to use an example, and Richard mentioned this in his remarks, but the Mark 41 launchers that are used in the Aegis system that I mentioned earlier that launched these SM-3 missiles, they're also able to launch the Tomahawk cruise missiles. So while the SM-3 missile is a defensive missile, the Tomahawk cruise missile is an offensive missile. It's a long-range offensive missile that can be nuclear tipped as well. Not necessarily, but yeah. So I say it can be nuclear capable. Both the launchers and the Tomahawk missiles are manufactured by Raytheon. But you can see here, this is just a graphic from a catalog for the Mark 41 launcher, and you can see here they're advertising the interchangeability, the versatility of this Mark 41 launcher. And while it can be used for this SM-3 defensive missile that I mentioned earlier, that you can see here, BMD being ballistic missile defense, it can also be used for strike warfare. So, you can also put a Tomahawk missile in there. And in addition, there have been reports that the Ukrainians have been, shooting air defense missiles into Russian cities, and also with stolen S-300. So S-300 are the Russian ballistic missile defense systems. The Ukrainians have been using stolen S-300 missile defense systems to launch offensive strikes into Russia. So this fact is not lost on the Russians, the fact that these missile defense systems are interchangeable with offensive systems. So this is a quote by Anatoly Antonov, the Russian ambassador to the U.S. He said that the result of the U.S. withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty was Russia's forced decision to develop hypersonic missiles that can penetrate any missile defense system in order to maintain strategic stability. So he's saying here that, he's pointing to this arms race potential for missile defense system, that because you withdrew from the treaty, we had to develop these hypersonic missiles to evade your defensive missile systems. He goes on to say, now they keep telling us that Russian weapons are creating a dangerous situation. This is despite the fact that defensive American Mark 41 launchers, which are located in Romania and are to be deployed in Poland, can be adapted for launching offensive Tomahawk strike missiles, as I just mentioned. When we express concern about this, we are told, in effect, to just trust us. So that's all I have. So I think we could open up for questions.
Okay, thanks very much,
Yeah.
Patrick and
Thank you.
Richard. That's quite a bit of information. Just before we get into questions, we're going to ask people if you're willing to sign on to an urgent action alert to Congress. The fact of the matter is, at this point, President Biden is refusing to give the green light for Ukraine to use long-range missiles beyond that dotted line that Richard had drawn on the map there, and to strike deeper into Russia. And for the first time, Russia has said, if that happens, we would retaliate outside of Ukraine. We would hit NATO assets. Could be in the Middle East, could be in Europe, could be anywhere. Didn't say that. We would hit them with conventional weapons. And so the idea would be not that Russia would launch a nuclear war at that point, but that it would start to take out NATO facilities around the world. And of course, NATO would respond to that. And that's how we get into this really dangerous situation that is upon us right now. We are fortunate that so far, President Biden has refused to give permission for those long-range missiles. And I'd ask, when we get to it, whether we're talking about Tomahawk missiles or whether we're talking about long-range ATACMS or Shadow, the other ones that Richard was talking about. There's a long way of saying that we would ask people to consider signing on to this urgent action alert that Brian is going to put up why don't you just take it over, Brian, and explain how people do what people do on this?
Sure, Paul. And if it's not your first time with us, you'll be familiar with this process. If you click the link that I have now put in the chat a few times, it'll take you right to a screen. A window will pop up. All you have to do is put in your address. It automatically looks up your members of Congress and allows you to send them a message. Now, we've pre-written one in opposition to exactly what Paul was just saying, easing the restrictions on escalation of the war in Ukraine. You can personalize that if you want. In fact, I encourage you to do so. But this is a really easy tool. In less than a minute, you're able to send a message to your congressperson and both of your senators. So I encourage you to do that, and I'll also include it in a follow-up email to all of you.
Okay, thanks, Brian. So if you go to that link that Brian put in the chat, click on it. It'll open up this alert. You can just fill in the information. We're going to take 46 seconds here to let you do that. We'll have dead air for about a half a minute here so that you can go through this process. If you agree with this statement that we want to send to Congress, it'd be a very important decision that President Biden makes. So far, he has made the right decision on this. In the past, he has always backed down on various weapon systems, saying no, and then eventually allowing them to be sent to Ukraine, along with, of course, all the NATO technicians and troops and everything else needed to operate these things. but this time so far under pressure evidently from the Pentagon. And the fact that the Pentagon is very concerned that Russia is not kidding and that Russia would hit US and NATO assets elsewhere in the world if these long-range missiles started hitting Moscow in places deeper into Russia. So that's the situation we face. I hope you'll fill out that form. It'll be sent automatically to your members of Congress, and hopefully they will keep Biden from approving this very, very dangerous move. Of course, Zelensky, in addition to calling for the long-range missiles, has asked for immediate NATO membership for Ukraine, which again, which would kick off a war between the US and Russia, and also for the deployment of NATO troops in Ukraine. So that's his new battle plan for how to win the war. So we're operating on dangerous turf right now. It's an important time for us to pay attention to this, and hopefully we can avoid nuclear war. Well, it would be a conventional war first, and as Richard said, eventually turn into a nuclear war, most likely as soon as one side or the other started using the short range. I'm sorry, the limited nuclear weapons, the battlefield nuclear weapons, but unfortunately that eventually turns into all-out nuclear war between us and Russia. So given that situation, I do want to tell people that Stephen Kinzer, the Globe columnist, is going to be doing a webinar on Ukraine and Gaza and on U.S. foreign policy on November 11th, 6 days after the election. The title of the webinar is After America Votes: What the Next 4 Years May Bring to Gaza, Ukraine, and the rest of the world. And you can register for that webinar now. It's up on the events page of Mass Peace Action. Sorry to talk so long. Brian, thanks for doing that urgent action alert. Hopefully people have filled it in. And let's go to questions and answers. The way we'll do this is for people to go to the reaction menu item at the bottom of your screen, click on it, and raise your hand, and we will start to work through people who raise their hands. So I see we have Jeffrey already ready to go here. Jeffrey, do you have a question?
Go ahead and unmute yourself, and there you go.
All right. After this, I gotta leave for the next meeting. So
Okay.
all right. I had a plan. I want to know if this could work to end the war, end the Russia-Ukraine war. The West agrees that NATO won't be included into NATO, but on a few conditions. Ukraine becomes a neutral state like Switzerland. Russia must give back all the territory that they took from Ukraine, including Crimea. All pro-Russian and pro-Putin Ukrainian-born separatists that were involved in the fighting against the Ukrainian government are to be exiled to Russia. The reason is so that the United States, NATO, and Russia can use Ukraine as a place to restore relations between each other. And once relations and trust between US, NATO, and Russia have been restored, and then Ukraine's neutrality status will be removed and replaced with both Ukraine and Russia being included into NATO. Because I know back in the early 2000s, Russia wanted to be included into NATO.
Okay, thanks, Jeffrey. About Patrick or Richard, you want to respond to Jeffrey's question?
Did you include in your question that, or in your proposed peace plan, that who would have to go back to Russia from Ukraine?
The Ukrainian-born pro-Russian and pro-Putin separatists
Okay.
that were involved in the fighting against the government.
Okay. Your peace plan is a non-starter. First of all, those Russians that you would send back to across the border, they've been there in varying degrees, for I don't know, up to 1,000 years. So that would, I don't think they would be willing to be uprooted from their homes and be sent over to Russia. There's a lot of them, 6 million, 8 million, I don't know, a very significant amount of them. And that would be a non-starter from both their point of view as a part of the Ukrainian population and from Russia's point of view. Also, Russia will never give up the territory that it's taken. It was willing to do precisely that as almost as soon as it invaded. A month after the invasion, there was a negotiated peace plan, a Minsk agreement, which would have guaranteed Ukrainian neutrality. And with the exception of Crimea, Russia would be willing to withdraw on the understanding that there would be some kind of limited autonomy for the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine. They would get to maintain the Russian language, which Ukraine had decided to eradicate previously, and so on. But the US and Germany primarily and Britain had no intention to abide by that agreement, and they merely used it to buy time to build up the Ukrainian army more. So Russia has no trust whatsoever for any agreement that would be made with NATO and the United States. And therefore, since it cannot trust the US and NATO to abide by any agreement, it will not give up the territory that it has taken and feels it needs to keep to defend itself from, US missiles on the Russian border.
Okay, so that's an interesting idea, Jeffrey, but we have to move on to other questions. Barbara Winsat.
Go ahead and unmute yourself, Barbara.
She's not here right now. Could she be later in the queue?
Okay, let's put her
Sure.
later on. Let's go to Richard Oakes.
I'm with Baltimore Peace Action, and my question is, what is considered long range? I know there's short range ATACMS and long range ATACMS, but what is considered long range?
You want to take that one, Patrick?
Yeah. Actually, maybe if I could share my screen really quick, because I have I had a backup slide that I think maybe answers this question with a nice graph. But yeah, so you can see here, typically short range ballistic missiles are considered between 300 and 1,000 kilometers. Medium range ballistic missiles between 1,000 and 3,000 kilometers. Intermediate range between 3 and 5.5 kilometers. 100 kilometers. And intercontinental ballistic missiles, anything over 5,500 kilometers. And then you can see there are various systems that are designed to defend against ballistic missiles with those ranges that you can see here on the left. So does that answer your question?
So Patrick, in terms of the Ukraine situation, what would a long-range missile be? Does it mean a Tomahawk, or does it mean an ATACMS that has a 700-mile range? What does it mean in terms of Ukraine?
Yeah, so it's kind of the longest range that I guess we'd be talking about for Ukraine would be something, like the Tomahawk missiles, which Zelensky is currently requesting from the U.S. And I'd have to check the numbers. My understanding is they would fall somewhere in kind of the medium range ballistic missile range. So, somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 kilometers.
Right. So it would not necessarily be just ATACMS then, or Shadows.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I would add that in the mass media, they've sort of created new terminology for public consumption. That is, the debate is that you announced at the beginning of the program about striking deep inside of Russia. There articles have appeared which use the word long range, talking about this, but really what they're talking about is about 155 miles. Well, in military parlance, that's not long range. That's short to medium range. But in the public debate now, it's sort of publicly confused with long range just because of its association with striking deep into Russia. And so far, the only thing that's been under consideration was about 155 miles. The other versions of those same missiles can go about 340 miles. And after that, then you jump up to the 700-mile German Taurus and the 1,500-mile U.S. Tomahawk.
But Ukraine is requesting Tomahawks, right?
Oh, yeah.
So those would reach Russia pretty easily. I mean,
Oh,
Moscow.
Yeah.
well, Moscow's only 400 miles, so
Right.
yeah. Mhm.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the question. Thanks for the answers. Anatol Zuckerman?
Yes, hello. Good evening. I was born in Ukraine 87 years ago. In 1962, I remember the Caribbean crisis when the world came to the very edge of the nuclear disaster, and it's coming again in my native Ukraine. So I see the only solution to this suicidal behavior is to stop sending weapons to Ukraine and to start negotiating again. There were two international peace agreements in 2014 and 15 that did not work, but all the humans can do now is to continue negotiating. So I wonder, what do you authors think about that possibility?
Thank you for that, Anatol.
I think that negotiations are on the horizon because Ukraine has lost the war. And it appears that the United States feels it's not in a position at this point to go to war, direct conflict with Russia. That means that Ukraine will have to negotiate very shortly. If they don't, Russia will just continue marching all the way to the Dnieper River for starters. I don't even know how Ukraine's going to make it through the winter. They're only going to have like 15% of their heating capacity and their electrical capacity during the winter. The economy's in a shambles. Manufacturers in a shambles. It's the only soldiers they're able to get now, or they're rounding them up in bars and classrooms, and they go to the front with no training. The war is over, and Ukraine is going to have to negotiate very soon.
Hopefully.
The only way that could not happen is if the U.S. decides to start using nuclear weapons.
Yeah, well, one historic note in 1654, at the end of the war with Russia and Poland, the Ukraine was partitioned along the Dnieper River. So it may happen again in 2025.
When did that happen?
1654.
Oh,
Russian Tsar Alexis united with the Zaporozhye Cossacks, and they defeated um, Polish army. Well, there was a split, all right, it was a draw. So they do partitioned Ukraine along the Dnieper River.
Well, thank you. And I'll just, I'm gonna take advantage of you asking that question and making that point, to share this screen here. Because at Mass Peace Action, we have a campaign going which is focused exclusively on negotiations and ceasefire as a way of ending the war in Ukraine and as a way of avoiding the destruction of Ukraine and this tremendous danger posed to the rest of the world by what's happening in this war right now. So we have a lot of good resources here, a lot of good videos, some really important things here. But the main thing is we're asking people to do everything you can to tell your representatives in Congress to change U.S. policy from continuing to go down this road that is leading to such catastrophe, and instead to push for negotiations to save whatever can be saved of Ukraine and to end this incredible killing. Hundreds of thousands of troops, primarily Ukrainian, have been killed or seriously wounded. It's a demographic disaster for Ukraine. So whatever your perspective on the war, whether you supported Ukraine victory over Russia or saw the war in some other way, we're hoping that everyone can come together at this dangerous point in the war to change the direction of our policy and to force our country to enter into negotiations and to stop hindering Ukraine from entering into negotiations, as we did back when the war started. So please get involved with us. I think Brian is going to put a link to the place, to the document where you can sign up to join in on this campaign. There's a lot of things you can do, so please take advantage of that. So let's go back to questions here. Let's see, we had Anatole. Let's see, Mary Sifferlin, do you have your hand raised? I can't see anymore. Here we go.
Go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering if you could talk about the glide bombs that Russia is using, and is Russia firing long-range missiles into Ukraine? And what kind of weapons are they getting from North Korea and Iran? And why wouldn't that be considered an provocation or an escalation?
It certainly is an escalation, obviously, and it's been going on ever since Russia invaded in 2022, it took about a year and a half before Russia had enough command of the air that they could use these missiles all over, everywhere in Ukraine with anytime they wanted to. So yes, Russia, in that sense, the war is very one-sided. Russia, the glide bombs are there. Once the bomb is released from the airplane, wings spring out, and therefore the bomb can glide usually
I'm on a webinar.
Like 40 to 60
Not
miles
done yet.
farther than when the airplane released it. And not only can they glide that much farther, but they are precision guided weapons. And they will hit their targets, whatever their designated targets are. And anti-aircraft systems are not capable of taking out these small glide bombs. They're tremendously effective on the battlefield. Russia is using them, and because the Ukrainians essentially don't have an air force. I mean, they do have aircraft, but very few, and they're taken out when they're used. They're taken out on the ground before they're used. So yes, Ukraine, if it had a functional air force, could be using precision glide bombs as well. And I'm sure the US would be happy to provide them. But unfortunately, they don't have an effective air force that can use them. But in terms of your point about even Steven, in terms of weapons, yes, you're absolutely right. It's very, very one-sided. Russia has all the weapons and Ukraine has hardly any. If Ukraine had them, then of course we would be at war with Russia because they would be used every day to strike targets inside of Russia. And that's why that's one of the reasons why Ukraine doesn't have them, because so far the US is afraid to go to all-out war with Russia. And if the US and NATO made it more even-steven on the battlefield, then we would be at full-scale war with Russia.
Thanks, Richard. Pretty ominous stuff. Okay, let's go, and thanks for the question, Mary. Let's go to Donald Smith.
Hi. So yes, just following up, my question was directly related to what you said. Okay, so suppose the US or NATO gave them more advanced weapons, but told Ukraine, well, just use it inside of Ukraine. We gave them glide bombs and other things. So my point is, there were like 30 or 40 nations of US and most of Europe are now fighting this proxy war with Russia. It's sort of a mystery that they can't win. And I'm surprised that Russia is winning this war, given the amount of money, the hundreds of billions of dollars that NATO is spending. Russia's military budget is a fraction of what the US and NATO's budget is. So I'm curious why Russia's winning, even if Ukraine isn't allowed to shoot, into Russia's homeland. And maybe after the election, by the way, this could change. Maybe I'm thinking that after November, after the election next week, maybe something's going to change, and maybe you can comment on that.
I think one of the main reasons is because the U.S. spends $200 million on one F-35 fighter. It spends a lot of money on super sophisticated weapons. It spends a lot of money on its nuclear weapons. The Russians spend most of their money on tanks, artillery pieces, their aircraft, which are superior to most U.S. aircraft. Hypersonic missiles. U.S. doesn't even have hypersonic missiles. Russia produces something like 5 times as many artillery shells on a monthly basis as the US and Western Europe combined. And it produces about, many times more tanks than the US and Western Europe combined. Russia is right next door to Ukraine. Russia is defending Russians inside of Ukraine. They're Ukrainian citizens, but they're ethnic Russians. The Russian part of Ukraine is full of people who spy for Russia and tell Russians where what buildings are the Ukrainians in. The U.S. is on the other side of the world, and it's hard to fight from the other side of the world, even if you have more money and more weapons. You know, those are some of the reasons why Russia is prevailing.
And keep in mind, though, that the Ukrainians have attacked many sites in Russia proper, you know, with drones and rockets.
Yep.
This regular attacks on Russian territory by Ukrainian rockets and drones. Some of them have been quite successful attacks, blowing up huge amounts of petroleum and everything else.
Ammunition dumps, yeah.
Ammunition
yeah.
dumps, everything else. So Ukraine,
They've even attacked Moscow.
Ukraine has been attacking Russia also, not nearly to the degree that Russian missiles and everything are leveling parts of Ukraine. But we've been fortunate so far that Russia has not decided to react to that and to basically absorb those blows. But these long-range attacks would do much more serious harm, obviously. And in fact, one long-range attack already took place on the Russian early warning system, which is essential for Russia to know whether it's being attacked with nuclear weapons. And so Ukraine is hitting some pretty significant targets inside Russia itself with the weapons that it already has. Let's go to Barbara Wimsattler. Yeah, Barbara, you all set?
You're
Like,
muted.
you just gotta unmute yourself.
Barbara.
Okay, so one thing that really bothers me is that, you know, it feels like we're talking to each other, but no, the rest of the world or the rest of our country does not have access. In fact, I haven't heard a word about Ukraine in the media. You know, they talk about Israel morning, noon, and night, but not a word about Ukraine. And I just think, you know, this. I don't
It's
see
taken
it.
for granted that
It's really just
Russia is the evil.
yeah. I mean, it's very it's highly disturbing. I just think this, you know, the money, the death, the destruction that's happening, and you know, somehow we're just all sitting back and hello. I mean, I appreciate what you people are doing, but it's, you know, it's not reaching out broadly enough to, or maybe people wouldn't even listen. I don't know.
The idea that we tell Ukraine not to negotiate because we can win, where win means Russia will lose.
Okay, let's have Richard or Patrick comment. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you for your work.
Thanks very much.
Well, at least finally, in the last 2 months, you know, the Russian victory is so pronounced now that even the mass media cannot ignore it anymore. They can't lie to us anymore. They can't deny it anymore. So it's creeping into, you know, the national press and the national airwaves. Unfortunately, it mainly has only creeped into the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, but at least it's creeping in, and it won't be long before everybody realizes that Russia has won and Ukraine has to negotiate a deal that leaves Russia in charge of everything that it's taken.
Yeah, which just didn't have to be. You know, if the agreements that Russia had signed on to, if the NATO had not violated those agreements, Ukraine would be right now an independent country with its Russian areas having autonomy, and it would not be part of NATO, of course. It's just such a tragedy that this whole disaster has happened, and it just, if it doesn't show us what the foolishness and disaster of war, imagine firing all these multi-million-dollar missiles all over Europe, and the cost to that, and the suffering and destruction. And none of this had to be if NATO had not violated 3 or 4 major agreements that it had already signed. Whatever you think of the Russian invasion, it's certainly illegal, but it's I don't think the US or any other country would allow a country just determined to overthrow your government to set up shop right on your border. So it's a tragedy beyond description. We are having success. We do tablings in the greater Boston area, asking people to sign postcards to their congressional representatives, calling for negotiations and ceasefire. We've been doing this for 3 years. We've had thousands of these postcards signed. And what we find is that a lot of people agree that negotiations are the way to go. You would never know that from watching television. If you watch TV, you will not see Jeffrey Sachs or John Mearsheimer or any of these other esteemed academics and journalists who have a different perspective from our administration. You won't even see them on TV. All they will do is interview these people from these think tanks that support continuing the war in Ukraine until Ukraine wins a victory. And they have brought us once again to the edge of disaster, as they have done in these other wars in the past. So please get involved in efforts. Whatever your perspective on the war, please get involved in these efforts, because this is a critical time to move the battle to negotiations and away from this continued escalation all the time. We're pretty much out of time. I think, oh, Mary Ellen, I see. I'm sorry, you have a question. Go ahead.
Not so much a question, but just a comment that there is a lot, I don't know if it's a lot, I would like to see polling, but I have specific interactions with people who have a lot of resentment that we're sending all this money to Ukraine, especially in the wake of the hurricane and the disaster that's happening in the South. So I think that's also something that is kind of on our side. Getting the elites and the politicians to listen to us is a little tough, but just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mary Ellen. Patrick or Richard, do you have any comments on that?
Yes, and we can't forget that Donald Trump and significant portion of the Republican Congress and the Republicans at large, particularly any libertarian types, they're not into these foreign wars. They're not into having their money spent on all these foreign wars. They want more of the money to stay at home. And we may not like Donald Trump or libertarians, but they actually are a very significant force right now for ending the war in Ukraine and for negotiating.
It's a strange situation. Okay, I think that is it. Again, Brian, if you could put that link to the sign-up form for anyone that wants to get involved in whatever way you can in pushing for ceasefire and negotiations in Ukraine, it would be great if you would sign on to that. That very simple form. We'll be in touch with you about events going on, both educational and action events, as well as work around Congress. So please, if you think this war should end, please sign up. So I think we're pretty much done here. Remember, November 11th, the webinar with Stephen Kinzer. Hope you'll sign up for that. And it's time for us to hold our breath until next Tuesday is over. Thanks everyone for joining us. Brian, is there anything else that we should mention?
No, just watch out for your inboxes. I am going to send a follow-up with all of this information. We threw a lot at you. And we encourage you to share the recording with your friends and family. Bring more people in.
That's right. You'll be able to have the link to the recording. And you also have that sheet that Richard put together on the different missiles. So you can refer to it when you're looking at when you hear about these missiles in the news and all that, you can kind of understand now what missiles are involved and what their capabilities are and what disaster they bring to the world. Thank you, Patrick, so much for clarifying a lot of those issues around so-called defensive missiles. And thanks, Richard, for your analysis of the different weapon systems being used in this terrible war. And hopefully, now that we understand a little bit better just what's going on, we'll be all motivated as much as possible to end this war. So good night, everybody. Thanks a lot.